All right, so ready to dive into some serious economic policy today.
Always up for a deep dive, especially when it comes to something as crucial as the U.S. Treasury.
Yeah, this chapter you sent over from Mandate for Leadership, well, it's a lot.
Intense is one word for it. It's basically a blueprint for how a conservative administration would completely reshape the Treasury Department.
Exactly. They cover everything: taxes, regulations, how the U.S. interacts with the global financial system. You name it, they've got opinions.
It's a fascinating look at how much power the Treasury Department really has, even if most people don't think about it on a daily basis.
And they definitely don't mince words. Like right out of the gate, they call the current Treasury a failure, pointing to, the national debt going up, even bringing up how much the average person's 401k has gone down.
It's a very deliberate tactic. They're trying to paint a pretty bleak picture of the status quo, right? Setting the stage for their proposed solutions by making you feel like something has to change drastically.
And for them, change starts with completely shifting priorities. They even quote Secretary Yellen directly, from the Treasury Department's actual strategic plan, where she talks about things like racial equity and climate change as part of their mission.
And that's a huge point of contention for the authors of this chapter. They think those issues are completely outside the scope of what the Treasury should be handling.
Which is where things get really interesting, because it becomes this clash of ideologies, right? Two completely different visions for what America should be playing out in the world of economic policy. And the Treasury Department is stuck right in the middle of it all.
Absolutely. And taxes are a major battleground.
Oh, for sure. And their big idea is basically to just scrap the entire tax code and start over. Two individual tax rates, 15% and 30%. That's it.
It's a bold proposal. They argue that such a simplified system with lower rates across the board will unleash economic growth and lead to more jobs. Of course, economists are constantly debating just how much of an impact such changes would actually have.
And then on top of that, they want a flat 18% corporate tax rate. Just boom, across the board.
Right, a classic conservative approach. Lower taxes, fewer regulations. The idea is to create what they see as a more business-friendly environment.
And that's not even the most radical part. They also want to limit how much of your salary can be untaxed benefits, like, when your employer contributes to your health insurance or retirement plan.
Right, those benefits are currently tax advantaged.
Exactly. But they want to put a cap on that, something like $12,000. And anything above that gets added to your taxable income. It's like they're trying to reinvent how we even think about getting paid.
Their goal is to encourage employers to offer higher wages instead of relying so heavily on benefits. The idea, at least from their perspective, is that it would make it easier for people to switch jobs and move up the economic ladder.
Okay, so we've got simplified taxes, a whole new approach to compensation, and then they just drop this bomb. They want to basically dismantle the IRS as we know it.
Dramatically overhaul might be a gentler way of putting it.
Fair enough. But their point is the IRS is too big, too powerful, too intrusive.
Their solution is to essentially rein it in. More political appointees to oversee things, a major technology upgrade, a much tighter budget. The goal is to significantly reduce the agency's scope and authority.
And that whole reduce the scope idea, that seems to apply to a lot more than just the IRS, especially when these authors start talking about social programs and what they call woke policies.
This is where their ideology really comes to the forefront. They argue that the government, and especially the Treasury Department, should not be involved in promoting social agendas.
It's a distraction, in their view.
Exactly. They think it distracts from the Treasury's core functions, which they believe should be limited to managing the national debt, collecting taxes, ensuring the stability of the financial system, those kinds of things.
So anything related to racial equity at the Treasury, they want it gone. No more special initiatives, committees, nothing. They see it as straight up discriminatory and completely outside the bounds of what the Treasury Department should be doing.
It's a stark contrast to how the current administration sees things, right? They've made racial equity a key focus of their economic policies. So you can really see the fundamental philosophical difference here. Should the government actively work to address historical inequalities? Or should it simply focus on creating what they see as a level playing field and then let individuals succeed or fail on their own merits?
And it's the same story with climate change, huh?
Pretty much. They basically want the Treasury Department to completely disengage from anything related to climate change.
Out of international agreements, no more investing in green technology or clean energy.
Right. They have a very different perspective on this. While they acknowledge that climate change, a global issue.
Did you have to? Right.
Well, yeah. But their stance is that international agreements like the Paris Agreement ultimately hurt the U.S. economy more than they benefit the environment globally.
So their answer is, what, to focus on making the U.S. energy independent?
Exactly, specifically through domestic oil and gas production.
Which makes sense given how they see climate action, as a potential threat to American prosperity.
It's all about how you frame the issue, isn't it? To them, a strong U.S. economy isn't just good for Americans, it's essential for global leadership.
Hmm.
And they argue that a lot of these policies aimed at reducing emissions, particularly when they're done in conjunction with other countries.
It ends up backfiring.
That's their argument, that it hinders more than it helps. So yeah, the U.S. going it alone on climate change seems to be their preference.
Got it. Going it alone. Which, speaking of, these authors are really focused on China. Like, it seems like every other page is about how the U.S. needs to counter China's influence.
It's a major theme, for sure. They clearly see China as a significant economic threat to the U.S.
Okay, so how do they propose dealing with that?
Well, they're particularly worried about China's growing technological power and the fact that they have access to a lot of American innovation, right?
Right.
So they believe the Treasury Department needs to take a much more active role in protecting U.S. economic interests globally.
More active how? Like, what are they suggesting?
One of their main tools is something called CFIUS,
CFIUS.
the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States.
Catchy. So for those of us who don't speak bureaucrat, what is that exactly?
So basically, CFIUS is this government body that has the power to review and potentially block foreign investments in U.S. companies.
If they think it's a bad deal.
Well, more like if they think it poses a national security risk. So let's say a Chinese company wants to buy a major stake in a U.S. tech company.
Right.
CFIUS can step in and say, nope, not going to happen.
Interesting. And this chapter wants to give them even more power.
They want to use it way more aggressively, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Their goal is to prevent China from acquiring American companies, particularly in areas like AI, semiconductors, anything they deem strategically important.
To keep that competitive edge.
Exactly. They see it as kind of an economic arms race.
An arms race, which leads us to, and I'm sorry because I'm still stuck on this, the School of Financial Warfare idea. Like,
Right.
Really, that's their big idea.
Yes, certainly.
Yes. It sounds like something out of a movie, right? They're talking about creating a whole institution that's dedicated to weaponizing the U.S. dollar. What does that even look like in the real world?
It's a pretty bold proposition. Essentially, they're arguing for the U.S. to be a lot more strategic and assertive in how it uses its financial power on the global stage.
So we're talking about things like, what, economic sanctions?
Sanctions, investment restrictions, targeted lending.
Yeah.
Basically, using the fact that the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency.
Right.
Using that to influence other countries' behavior.
So you're saying the U.S. could basically just decide to cut off a country's access to the global financial system, if they wanted to.
That's the implication.
Yeah.
And obviously, that would make it incredibly difficult for that country to do business, access their money.
Yeah, it would be crippling.
Which is why this idea is so controversial, right?
Yeah.
There are all sorts of questions about whether it's ethical.
To use money as a weapon, basically.
Exactly. And then there's the whole issue of unintended consequences and the impact on global stability. But to these authors, it all comes back to that same core idea, American strength and leadership. They believe that with countries like China becoming more powerful, the U.S. can't afford to be passive.
So it's all about projecting power, even if that means bending the rules a little.
Or maybe bending them a lot a day, depending on how you view it, which is something for our listeners to think about, right? How far is too far?
It really makes you think, right? Like, if even half LF of what we just talked about actually happened, it would be huge.
It would be a completely different economic landscape, for sure.
Taxes would be totally different, for one thing.
Potentially. Yeah, that whole flat tax idea would have major implications for pretty much everyone.
And your paycheck could look different, too, if employers start shifting how they do benefits because of that cap they want to put in place.
Right, that's a really interesting proposal. Whether it would work as intended is another question. Economists have been debating that kind of thing for decades.
Right, right. And then you turn on the news and some Chinese company is trying to buy, I don't know, a U.S. tech company.
And suddenly CFIUS is involved, blocking the deal.
Because it's a national security threat or whatever.
Well, that would be their argument, yeah.
Yeah.
Which gets to the heart of a much bigger question, really. What role should the government play in the economy?
Especially in a globalized world. It's not like the U.S. exists in a bubble or anything.
Exactly. And then there's the whole financial warfare thing.
Which is just wild when you really think about it.
That's a whole other level.
Yeah.
Using the financial system as a tool of statecraft, it's not exactly a new idea.
Right. But actually setting up a school for it, it's kind of scary.
It definitely raises some eyebrows.
Yeah.
But again, it all goes back to their worldview. They see the world as this very competitive place, and they believe the U.S. needs to be prepared to use every tool at its disposal to maintain its position.
Even if that means playing a little rough.
Even if it means that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is something for everyone to consider, right? Because it's easy to dismiss these ideas as being too radical or out there.
But if they actually happen...
It would have huge consequences for all of us.
Exactly. And it just goes to show the Treasury Department, it might seem kind of boring, but...
It impacts everyone's life in a very real way, whether they realize it or not.
Well said. So there you have it, the Treasury Department. More important than you think.
And definitely more interesting than it might seem at first glance.
Exactly. That's why we do these deep dives. Until next time, everybody, keep those brains engaged.